This passage is about Marxism and what Marxism was before it became the proper Marxism, that is, one based on dialectical and historical materialism. Let's read the passage quickly. Both Stalin and Mao had helpfully provided official accounts of Marxist thoughts with due acknowledgement to his very influential friend Friedrich Engels, and there were committed intellectuals on both sides who were more than fluent in the relevant arcana of dialectical and historical materialism. So the dialectical and historical materialism that was propounded by Marx and his colleague Frederick Engels was recognized by the official account of it was given by Stalin and Mao, and people have since given theories on that. However, the new humanist Marx was quite insulated from all this since his 1844 manuscript thoughts were Hegelian without anyone's dialectics. Hegel was another philosopher. So, Marx, the new humanist Marx, the author calls him the humanist Marx, was different. He was Hegelian, more like Hegel, without having any dialectics, and historical without materialism. So the new Marx was different from the one that was supported by Stalin and Mao. That's what the first paragraph says. In their own way, they appeared to be quite original, so the youthful Marx could be taken on his own terms without predating any Marxisms at all. Thus, any Cold War battle lines, whether intellectual or geographical. So, these thoughts, the new Marxist thoughts, were quite original, and so youthful Marx could be taken on his own terms. One of David MacLean's first and most influential and successful paperbacks was simply titled Marx Before Marxism. Marxism was the interpretation given of Marxist theories by various people, and Marx and Engels' theories put together. But there was a Marx before this who was the new Marx that we come across in books now, which have looked at that version of Marx. Got it? Significantly, the humanist Marx, this is the Marx who's not related to Stalin and Mao's interpretation. The humanist Marx had raised the question of economics, though not in the way that 20th century economists had made familiar. So, the humanist Marx is the Marx that is different from the Marxism that we know from now, was connected with economics, but this economics was different from the 20th century economists and their theories. Whether they were conventional micro or macroeconomists or Marxist economists in Moscow or Cambridge. So the economics that was given by the humanist Marx was very different from that propounded by micro, macro, Marxist economists in Moscow or Cambridge. The former mainstream economists overwhelmingly ignored Marx and dismissed Marxist economies as politically biased and lacking in rigor. Meanwhile, scholars and apparatchiks, Communist Party members are called that, well versed in Marxist economies, despised mainstream economists as uncritical proponents of capitalism. Both sides shared many presumptions and concepts nonetheless in theorizing capitalism. So, what is he talking about? He says the humanist Marx gave a different version of economists from Marxist economists of Moscow, Cambridge, micro or macro economists. Now, these guys were the micro macro economists were mainstream economists, right? They ignored Marx, they ignored Marxist economies, calling it politically biased and very lacking in rigor. The scholars and Communist Party members who knew Marxist economies, they criticized micro and macro economists or the mainstream economists and called them uncritical proponents of capitalism. What was common to both these people, both these types of Marxists, was that they gave lots of theories on capitalism. Refreshingly, the humanist Marx had set the stage for an examination of the capitalist societies in ways that bypassed all. Oh, let me get my pen right, sorry. The humanist Marx had set the stage for an examination of capitalist society. Humanist Marx also scrutinized and examined the capitalist society, but his method was different. How was it different? It bypassed all these efforts in economics in whichever opposing camp. The Marxists, the mainstream economists, they were criticizing capitalism. Marx's theory of capitalism was very different. It bypassed, it avoided all these theories. Alienation was neither economics nor Marxist, so it suited the new left of the 1960s. It functioned as a political critique that required relatively little study, given the brevity of Marx's early manuscript Notes to Self. In particular, the humanist Marx needed no study at all in conventional economic textbooks, based as they were and still are on rather abstractly asocial and ahistorical presumptions, and on evidential reasoning that is easily converted to mathematics. The new Marx, the humanist Marx, had his theory of economics, had his theory views on capitalism, but they were not in any. They avoided all the criticism, all the theories put forward by mainstream and Marxist economies, because he believed that the new economics was based on conventional economics textbooks, based on asocial and ahistorical, neither dealing with society nor history, asocial and ahistorical presumptions, and they were based on evidential reasonings that were easily converted into mathematical formulae or theories. So Marx avoided these in his theory of of examination of capitalist society. The early Marxist theory of alienation. This is Marxist theory. Marx, which is different from the Marxism we know, which the author calls Marx's theory of alienation. That obviously had an early part and a latter part, maybe. So he says the early Marxist theory of alienation, however, was rather less vague than it sounds. When you talk of alienation, it sounds vague, but it was not vague. It was less vague than it sounds, given that the word refers to feelings of otherness, separation, and estrangement. So when you think of alienation, what do you think of? Otherness, separation, alienation, that's what it means. But he says Marx's theory of alienation was different from this, was not as abstract or vague as this. In these manuscripts, now canonically as a widely translated text and ubiquitously accepted for university reading list, in his early notes, which are now considered canonical, means a canon is a law, an established law. So these theories are now considered pretty standard, and they've been widely translated. They are accepted ubiquitously, means present everywhere in university readings. Marx, in these notes, in his theory of alienation, as the author calls it, Marx was talking about capitalism as workers' experience it. He gave his theory of capitalism from the experience of workers, though in terms that were rather more psychological than sociological, but still historically specific, referring to mechanical production, wage labor, employment, and real or metaphorical assembly line conditions. So he gave his theory of alienation based on workers' experience. They were more psychological than sociological, but they were historically very relevant, specific, mechanized production, wage labor, and real or metaphorical assembly line conditions. So they were specific in terms of what they contained. The alienation detailed in Marx's ruminations were of workers from products, workers from processes, workers from each other, and workers from their species being. So, what is the alienation Marx is talking about? Alienation of the workers from the products, alienation of workers from the processes they are involved in, alienation of workers from each other, and alienation of workers from their species being. The first three could be easily visualized, even without, as was true of many student readers, much experience of such grinding condition. Now, when you are reading, what do you know about alienation of workers from products or alienation of workers from processes? Because many students have not been workers. But he says, even if you're not a worker, you can relate to the first three. That is, workers from products, workers from processes, workers from each other. You can easily relate to it. Students could easily relate to it. Whereas the last term, workers from their species being, this was intriguingly, okay, right, very puzzlingly philosophical, pointed towards something systemically out of whack with the human condition. This was something different. This is something that human condition cannot, which is out of sync. We can't really relate to what he means by that. Quoting the title of another widely read and self-evidently Germanic book of the times by Hannah Arendt, published in 1958. Any number of deeply felt, loosely organized, and generally inchoate critics of industrial modernity could then adopt Marx, extending even to the Catholic liberation theology and Latin American peasant farmer activism. So basically, the last one was a very puzzlingly, intriguingly philosophical thing. It was pointing to something systemically out of tune with the human condition. And any number of people who critique the industrial modernity could adopt this Marxist philosophy. That's what he says. Thus, this is the concluding lines of the passage. What does the author say? The humanist Marx could evidently stretch way beyond the author's self-directed and relentlessly argued atheism. The humanist Marx, obviously, there was the author, that is Marx, was a self-declared atheist and he argued for atheism. But the humanist Marx went beyond these and triumphed over still extant anti-religious persecutions conducted by the communist militants in self-styled market regime. It also was overcame. So there were a lot of anti-religion activities conducted by Marxist regimes. But humanist Marx was not concerned with them. He went over that, right? That is the passage. Let's look at the questions. According to the passage, what was rejuvenating about humanist Marxist teachings? We'll go back to the passage where he mentions that part, but let's quickly look at the options. It was based on a serious study of dialectical and historical materialism. We knew that the historical Marx did not follow dialectical and historical materialism, so A is wrong. It would have appealed even to scholars obsessed with presentism. There is nothing about scholars obsessed with presentism. So we have easily eliminated two options. It required little understanding or study even from the average man. Has the average man does the average man feature in it? Except the workers and their alienation. But does he talk about the average man understanding Marx? No. That leaves us only with one option. It bypassed Marxist and mainstream economics and focused on people. We know that it bypassed Marxist and mainstream economists as given in the passage here. Refreshingly, the humanist Marx had set the stage for an examination of capitalist society in ways that bypassed all efforts of economists in whichever opposing camp. So it bypassed all economic theories and focused on workers or focused on people. So correct answer is D.